April 24, 1980. Desert 1. Iran. Colonel Charles Beckwith stood in the darkness of the Iranian desert at a temporary staging area called Desert 1, 265 miles southeast of Tehran, and watched his mission unravel in ways that no planning document had anticipated and no training exercise had simulated. 8 RH-53DC Stallion helicopters had been launched from the USS Nimitz in the Arabian Sea for the mission. 6 were the minimum required. 3 had already been eliminated from the operation before reaching Desert 1, 2 with mechanical failures and 1 that had turned back when its pilots encountered a haboob, a massive dust storm that reduced visibility to near zero and that the mission planning had not adequately prepared the aircrew for. Of the 5 that remained at Desert 1, 1 had a hydraulic failure that maintenance personnel assessed as making it unsafe for the assault phase of the mission. 4 helicopters. The mission required 6. There was no margin. Colonel Beckwith made the assessment that Colonel Beckwith had been trained his entire career to make, an objective military judgment about whether a mission could proceed given the assets available. He concluded it could not. He recommended mission abort to General James Vaught, commanding the Joint Task Force. Vaught agreed. President Carter was informed. The order to abort was given. What happened in the next hour at Desert 1, as the force began the process of refueling and preparing for extraction, would have been tragic even if the abort decision had been the right decision, which the subsequent investigation confirmed it was. A helicopter in the crowded desert staging area, maneuvering in darkness and blowing dust, struck a C-130 tanker aircraft. Both aircraft exploded. 8 Americans died. The bodies of the dead were left in the Iranian desert when the surviving aircraft departed. The burned wreckage of the American helicopters and the C-130, with classified documents and equipment, was left for Iranian forces to find. It was the most visible American military failure since Vietnam. The images of the destroyed American aircraft in the Iranian desert, broadcast on Iranian state television and then around the world, were among the most damaging images in American military history, not because of the operational consequences, which were severe but limited, but because of what they communicated about American military capability at a moment when American credibility was already under extraordinary stress. The hostage crisis itself had begun in November 1979, when Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and seized 53 American diplomatic personnel. The Iranian revolutionary government of Ayatollah Khomeini had allowed the crisis to continue as a political tool, and 14 months of diplomatic efforts had produced nothing. President Carter, facing the specific political pressure of an election year and the accumulated pressure of a crisis that had consumed his presidency, had authorized the military rescue mission when diplomatic options appeared exhausted. The mission had been conceived and planned under extraordinary time pressure and secrecy constraints that had prevented the kind of interoperability training and coordination that a complex joint operation required. The Army unit that would conduct the assault on the embassy, Delta Force, which Colonel Beckwith had built and commanded, was capable and well trained for exactly this kind of operation. The Navy helicopter crews that would transport the assault element to Tehran had trained for the mission but had not trained with the Army personnel they would be transporting, and had not trained for the specific weather conditions that Iranian geography produces. The helicopter mechanical failures that eliminated 3 of the 8 Sea Stallions before reaching Desert 1 were not individually unusual, given the age and maintenance status of the aircraft involved and the demanding nature of the low-level night flight through adverse weather. What made them collectively decisive was the absence of adequate redundancy in the mission plan, a minimum of 6 helicopters that left no margin for the kind of equipment failures that even well-maintained military aircraft experience at high rates during demanding operations. The investigation that followed Operation Eagle Claw, conducted by a group of senior officers under Admiral James Holloway, identified these problems with a clarity that the military's institutional self-assessment processes had not always produced in previous failed operations. The Holloway Commission report concluded that the mission had been compromised by inadequate interoperability training between the service components involved, by insufficient redundancy in the helicopter force, by inadequate preparation for the specific environmental conditions of the Iranian desert, and by a command structure that had been designed for secrecy rather than operational effectiveness. The report's recommendations became the foundation for the most significant reform of American special operations capability in the history of the United States military. The Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, was established in December 1980, 8 months after the Eagle Claw disaster. Its mission was to provide the joint training, the standardized procedures, and the command structure that would ensure that the failures of Eagle Claw could not be repeated. The service components of Special Operations Forces, the Army's Delta Force, the Navy's SEAL Team 6, which had been established specifically in response to the Eagle Claw failures, the Air Force Special Operations Aviation, would train together, plan together, and operate under a unified command structure that ensured the interoperability that Eagle Claw had lacked. The transformation that followed was not immediate and it was not painless. Building true joint special operations capability required overcoming the institutional resistance that each service's special operations community had to sharing procedures and standards with other services, the kind of resistance that professional cultures always produce when asked to subordinate their specific practices to a common standard. But the imperative was clear and the political will to make the changes was sustained by the memory of 8 Americans dead in the Iranian desert and the images of burned American helicopters on Iranian television. The men who built JSOC and the joint special operations capability that it represented were building in the shadow of Eagle Claw in the specific sense that every decision about training standards and equipment selection and command procedures was informed by the question of what Eagle Claw had revealed about what happens when those elements are inadequate. The results of that building would not be visible for years. They would not be tested under conditions that revealed how complete the transformation had been until the events that followed September 11th. 2001 created the operational tempo that American Special Operations Forces would sustain for the next 2 decades. What the decade of building between Eagle Claw and the Gulf War, and then the decade between the Gulf War and September 11th, produced was a force that bore almost no resemblance in its capability to the force that had attempted Operation Eagle Claw in April 1980. Delta Force had been refined and expanded. SEAL Team 6, established specifically in response to the lessons of Eagle Claw, had developed into the Tier 1 Maritime Special Operations Force that its founders had envisioned. The Night Stalker helicopter unit, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, had been specifically created in response to the Eagle Claw aviation failures, with the specific mission of providing Special Operations Forces with helicopter support that met the exacting standards that Eagle Claw had revealed were necessary. The Night Stalkers trained to standards that made the RH-53D crews who had flown the Eagle Claw mission look underprepared by comparison, which they had been, not through any fault of the individual aviators but because the system that trained and equipped them had not been built to the standard that the mission required. The operations that the force built from Eagle Claw's lessons conducted in the years after September 11th, 2001 demonstrated the transformation with a specificity that the abstract description of organizational reforms cannot capture. The capture of Saddam Hussein in December 2003, conducted by JSOC forces using intelligence collection and analysis methods that had been developed and refined through years of post-Eagle Claw institutional investment, was a validation of the patient building that the Holloway Commission's recommendations had produced. The killing of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in June 2006, the result of an intelligence-driven targeting process that JSOC had refined into an operational methodology that no other military force in the world had developed to the same level, demonstrated what the Joint Special Operations Force that Eagle Claw had forced the American military to build had become. And on May 1, 2011, the SEALs of SEAL Team 6 and the Night Stalker pilots who carried them flew 2 custom stealth-modified Black Hawk helicopters and 2 Chinooks into Pakistan and conducted the operation that killed Osama bin Laden, bringing to a close a 10-year hunt for the man who had ordered September 11th. The helicopters that flew to Abbottabad in 2011 were the direct institutional descendants of the helicopters that had failed at Desert One in 1980. The operators who fast roped into the Abbottabad compound were the direct institutional descendants of the Delta Force soldiers who had been stranded in the Iranian desert. The connection was not metaphorical. The institutions that conducted the Abbottabad raid had been built, specifically and intentionally, in response to the failures of Eagle Claw. The standards they met, the training they had completed, the equipment they used, the command structure they operated under, had all been shaped by the question of what Eagle Claw had revealed about what was necessary for this kind of operation to succeed. 8 Americans had died at Desert One in April 1980. The country and the military that those 8 men served had responded to their deaths not with resignation but with the specific American response to failure that the military's history had repeatedly demonstrated, the systematic analysis of what had gone wrong and the systematic building of what was needed to make it right. What was built was JSOC. What JSOC became was the most capable special operations force in the history of warfare. What that force accomplished, from the capture of Saddam to the killing of Zarqawi to the raid on Abbottabad, was the answer to the question that Eagle Claw had asked about what American special operations forces needed to be. The answer took years to build. It was worth every year. The 8 men who died at Desert One did not die for nothing. They died as soldiers die, in the execution of a mission that their country asked them to execute, and that failed through the accumulated effect of inadequate preparation that the men themselves had not created and could not have overcome. What their country did with the failure they died in is the answer to the question of what America does with its worst moments. It builds something better. That is Eagle Claw. That is what 8 American deaths in an Iranian desert in April 1980 ultimately produced, not through any inevitable historical process, but through the specific decisions of specific people who looked at what had happened and decided that it would never happen again and built the institutions to ensure it would not. They built JSOC. They built SEAL Team 6. They built the Night Stalkers. They built the force that found Saddam and killed Zarqawi and stood in the Abbottabad compound at 1 a.m. on May 2, 2011 and looked at what they had come to do and did it. Eagle Claw failed. What America built because it failed did not.